15th, and I think as I said last week, so this Tuesday night Bible study actually begins the 28th year of studying the Bible. This 28th year, August the 12th, 1996 was our first Bible study, and since that week has passed, this begins our 28th year. I think I'm saying that right. Yes, of studying the Bible together. For that of which that thank you. I'm most humble about. Thank you so much. I want to join back our study talking about the providence of God. We've looked at it from a few angles. We talked about the problems that many of us have with the providence of God is because it's hard and it's invisible, and everyone has that problem with the providence of God. It's hard, it's invisible. We can't see it. I know it says it's working, but when we can't see it's working, many of us don't believe that it, in fact, is working. And so we looked at it for it being hard and invisible. But then we looked at it for being mysterious through the life of Abraham. How was God going to do what he promised Abraham he would do, and yet he instructed Abraham to, kill Isaac. And then we looked at it how it was not coincidental. Last week through the life of Moses, when we talked about all of the things that many would like to say they were coincidences, how Moses' mother gave up the baby after 3 months, and just by chance, Pharaoh's daughter got the baby. Just by chance that happened, and just by chance that happened. Just by chance he became, the second in command. Just by chance, all of those things. And I was showing us how the providence of God is not chance or fate. The providence of God is not coincidental. It's God sovereignly and providentially working to complete his purpose for mankind in history, if you will. And so we looked at that last week. And then I realized almost halfway through teaching last week, I said, Mike, you jumped. So you went too far. I actually need to back up. And that's literally what we're doing tonight. I have to back up and cover the life of Jacob, because the life of Jacob and Joseph, if you will, comes before the life of Moses. And what we find in the life of Jacob / Joseph is how God fulfills his purpose in history. How God fulfills his purpose in history, and how he did that through the life of Jacob and Jacob's son Joseph. So the way we've been looking at this providence, these 4 or 5 times, we've looked at it being hard and how it's been invisible. We can't see. For everyone, it's hard and invisible. It's mysterious through Abraham and how he would have to sacrifice his son, but yet be the father of many nations. How it's not, coincidental, chance, luck, or fate through the life of Moses. But we're going to back up today, and we're going to look at the life of Jacob and cover how Jacob's life, Joseph's life, actually fulfilled God's purpose in history. In other words, I think the way you may see it on your outline is the providence of God seems to work against us when actually is working for us. God said, my thoughts are not your thoughts. My ways are not your ways. My ways are not your ways. I know how we would do it. I know how you would do it if you were in charge. If you had the authority and the power, it would be logical and it would be rational, because we are what? Logical and rational beings. But God says, my ways are not your ways. God can work directly or indirectly. God can work with things or like he did in creation, ex nihilo. God can work without things. God can work a miracle where he doesn't even need nature. He can suspend something. He can suspend nature and still work things for the good. But we need, rational logic and nature to work together to, pull off our chance, luck, or fate. So I want us to look at the life of Jacob and his son Joseph and remind ourselves how when the providence of God is working in our lives, ladies and gentlemen, please understand, most of the time it's going to look like it's working against us. When the truth of the matter is working for us. If y'all was Baptist or Pentecostal, y'all could have shouted right there. because if we are honest with ourselves, if we're really, truly honest with ourselves, most of the time we don't understand what God is doing or how he's doing it providentially, sovereignly, and it looks like, it's working against us. We'll discover the providence of God, even if he has to use some good, some bad, and some ugly, it's still going to fulfill his purpose. And so we're going to back up and look at the life of Jacob. You know, that guy that you learned how to pray about, Yeah, that patriarch. And when you really want God to hear you, it's like you certain that God will hear your prayer if you just chunk Jacob's name in it, our Father God, the Father of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And that's like you're assuring, if you say that in your prayers, that God, he's going to give attention to it. Well, that Jacob who had, 12 sons, that Jacob who one of his sons was Joseph. And we want to see how in the life of Jacob, this trickster, this deceiver, how when you look at his life, it seems like all of that stuff worked against him, when the truth of the matter is it worked for him. Somebody here tonight, you might be right there in that place right now, where when you rationally, logically, sympathetically, emphatically, however you want to describe it, look at your situation, it seems as if it's working against you. There's no way on earth something good, at least not the good that I want, or the good that I even understand should come from this. There's no way in where it can happen, the way it's happening. I want you to see tonight through the life of Jacob and one of his favorite sons, Joseph, how things seem to be working against him when we find out all the time it was working for him. My opening thought says, because God is invisible to us, we often fail to recognize his active presence in human affairs, in, history, which is his story, and even in what? Our stories. Because God is invisible and he's not right there with us, and we don't look to the left or to the right, and we are certain of him, so it seems as if sometimes he's absent, if you will, from human affairs or what is happening in history, when the truth of the matter is history is his story. And can I help us out tonight? Our story is in his story. What would help us most when we think, reading the opening statement, the less of God's providence, would be to remind ourselves that the story of Israel's history really is the story of God's providential action. History is the ultimate goal of God's providence. I hope y'all are hearing me, y'all. We spend so much time, trying to remember history or go back in time and right the wrongs of history. Amen, 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 amen. You know, saying this should not have happened, you know. Yeah, I did get my definition of history right. It's his story, not ours. That there's nothing that transpired in history that the sovereign, providential God couldn't have, stopped from happening. So he allowed it to happen because the purpose for allowing it to happen so that the end goal, which is God's purpose being fulfilled in history, would happen. See, ladies and gentlemen, we could have less stress. We could be less easier. Okay, my library. Easier? Is that a better? We could be less confused if, ladies and gentlemen, we would remember the providence of God. Can't nobody walk up to us and talk to us about something black, something white, some politic, something, you can't walk up to me and put that burden on me and make me think that this wouldn't have happened if so-and-so wouldn't have happened. When I understand the providence of God, when I understand a God who can work with things ex nihilo, create from nothing, God who speaks and stuff, when I understand that even the wind and the water obey God, all of nature respond to God. God didn't want, if part of God's history was not the ugliness of Satan, Hitler, racism, all that other stuff, then y'all do know God could have stopped that, right? Y'all know that, right? And that's the hard part of the providence of God. Am I making sense with this? That's the mysterious part of the providence of God. You understand what I'm saying? Because we can't see how he could be working good in all of that bad. History is his story. And anytime our story gets bigger than his story, okay, let me move on because Jacob, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Abraham was Isaac's son, and we know that Jacob was what? Isaac was Abraham's son. They did that wrong. And Jacob was Isaac's son. And so let me just tell you a few things. I looked at this, and y'all, if you look at the scriptures I have for you, it's actually Genesis 28:10, verse 10, all the way to Genesis 48 and 22. And y'all know we're not going to read all those verses, right? Not tonight. Maybe when you leave here, you can use it as your devotion this week or something like that. But I'm going to do my best to cover all of those. I'm going to hit a few verses in between there, but I'm going to do my best to kind of do a broad painted stroke over all of that so we have some idea of what we're talking about, how those things seem to work against Jacob and even Joseph, but we find out they actually end up working for Jacob and Joseph. And so let me just spend a few minutes and share some things with you about both of their lives. Yeah, I'll come back to this. Jacob being the son of Isaac. Just some highlights, and I'm actually kind of running you through those chapters, if you will. Jacob's life began with a struggle. Y'all know the story of, Jacob and Esau, right? They were twins. You remember they were in their mother's womb. But Jacob's life began with a struggle. Now, Jacob. Did I say Jason again? Jacob. Remember, he's the one who wrestled with God, the angel. All night long, the theophany, the appearance of God on earth. Somebody will get this. Do any of y'all know that Jacob had a wrestling match in the womb of his mother? In Genesis, it tells us that, thank you. In Genesis, it tells us when Jacob and Esau, the twins, were in the womb of their mother, Jacob, that literally was a wrestling match that took place in the womb of their mother. And Jacob, he grabbed his brother's Esau heel, if you will. And so these twins were in the womb of their mother, but even in the womb of his mother, he was jousting, if you will, for position. He was born grasping his brother's heel. Jacob's name is translated, he who deceives. These are just some points that you would get from Genesis 28 to Genesis 45. When they were born and grew up, remember, they are Isaac's children. Esau was a hunter, and he was his father's favorite. Remember that, because it all fulfills itself. Esau was a hunter. He was his father's favorite, as Isaac loved wild game, while Jacob was favored by his mother. You see that in Genesis 25. And I want to say something about that. That form of destructive favoritism would follow into the next generation. Y'all got to be here, I said. Because most notably, we saw it with Jacob's favoritism for his son, who? Joseph. Jacob, his mother, he was his mother's favorite, and Esau was Isaac's favorite. And because they grew up in the house where they saw the favoritism, me and my wife, we have two children. If you allow them to tell you, they swear we got favorites. But it is known that there was favorites. And we saw how that destructiveness carried on even into Jacob's life, because he would have 12 sons, but he would end up having favorites amongst the 12. Certainly first would be Joseph, and second would be Reuben. Another point, Jacob, known as the deceiver, once he stole his brother's birthright, and Esau wanted to kill him, and Esau said, I'm going to kill him. Then Rachel, Jacob's mother, got in on it, the deception, and she basically said, listen, boy, you better run. I done called your uncle. I emailed him. I emailed your uncle who live over in Laban. Just go on. He looking for you, boy. Go on over there and hide, because if you stay over here, Esau and your daddy might kill you. You know the story. He went over there, and he saw, a fair girl. He wanted to marry her, and the trickster, the deceptor, he got deceived. The night of the wedding, he married the girl. The night of the wedding, he pulled back the veil. He's like, oh, this is the older. This ain't the one I wanted. And the uncle said, gotcha. You've been running around deceiving everybody. Gotcha. Somebody need to catch that. Somebody need to catch that. So he said, you spend your life deceiving folk, it'll come back get you. And he said, well, that ain't the one I wanted. He said, well, then, okay, I tell you what, I'll let you do it, but you can't embarrass me and the family. So this is what you're going to have to do. You have to work 7 more years, yada, yada, yada. Y'all know the story. I know y'all familiar with the story. And then he ended up with her, so he ended up having the second wife. But Jacob, uncle, he deceived him. During that time, Jacob had a dream. And we're going to talk about that a little bit. And the dream that he had was of a ladder that went to heaven. And at the top of it, you had angels ascending and descending. And we'll come back and we'll make that make sense. Anyhow, after Jacob had did all that he did and stayed and made the payment, he finally got his wife, the one that he wanted. He came to understand that his uncle Laban could be just as much a deceiver as he was. So all of that took place, as I already said. And then one of the next things, after the 20 years had passed, word got out that Esau was coming to where Jacob was. And the last words that Esau had told Jacob was, I'm going to kill you. And so Jacob, this deceiver who hasn't grown more spiritual, he hasn't grown in 20 plus years, he hasn't grown more spiritual as he should. He's thinking, well, man, maybe I need to try and do a peace offering with him. So the words get out that he's headed toward him. He's headed toward him. He sends some guys basically, to give him a peace offering to see what Esau would do. And you know the story behind all of that. 20 years had passed, and Esau's threat to kill him was still in his mind. You'll find that in 32. So Jacob gets these gifts. He sends them by his servant, hoping to pacify Esau. You find that in Genesis 32. Also in Genesis 32, Jacob asks the man his name, when this is when the wrestling match takes place. Jacob, he basically wrestles with the theophany, this angel of God, and he basically said, I'm not going to let you go until you promise to bless me. I'm not going to let you go. Now, please understand, y'all, if God wanted to get free, and it was theophany, he could have got free. Don't get caught up in that, all right? The very fact that God allowed him to wrestle all night, I believe that was a struggle that God allowed him to have. And then at the end, he still didn't win. What God got from him and what God promised him as a result of that was purposed by God. So in Genesis 34, something else takes place. Jacob, he's had some children. He got all these boys, but he have a daughter. Her name is Dinah. And some folk came in, and they actually raped Jacob's daughter. They raped Jacob's daughter, and finally all of the brothers hear what's going on. And once these brothers hear what's going on, they get angry. And their retribution was they did a trick to those people. They said, well, first you need to get circumcised all the men, and God gonna be with you. But oh no, man, we all right with you raping our sister. Don't worry about it. It's okay. We understand. That's the way they presented it. And then they said, matter of fact, this is what you do. Why don't all y'all like us, so you can have the protection of God that we have? Why don't all y'all get circumcised? And when you get circumcised, hey, what's ours is yours. God gonna love you. We gonna be brothers in Christ. Well, while they were healing from their circumcision, the sons of Jacob went in and killed all the men, because all of them got circumcised, all the men of the city. Killed them all. You see the deception still in his life. He kills all the men, and while all this is taking place, you got to understand, all this is going on, and he's thinking about what has happened in his life, and now Jacob, he's angry at what his sons do, so now they move back to Bethel, and when he moved back to Bethel, some other things happen. Rachel gives birth to another son, and she dies at the birth of this particular son, and this particular son, because Rachel was his favorite son, Benjamin, you had Joseph, you had Benjamin, you had Reuben. These were out of the 12 sons. These were, Jacob's favorite. Joseph, quite naturally, being number one because he's the one who wore the coats of what? Many colors. So you have all these similarities in the life of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, I want to show you Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Look at these similarities. In their stories, we see the importance of family. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We see the importance of family and the influence of family. For example, we see themes like deceit. We see favoritism. We see family strife. We see unexpected blessings. We see reconciliation. We see faith, flowing through the narratives. Mostly we see that God is faithful to his promises that he made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in spite of their sins. God chose to accomplish his kingdom purposes through these sinful people who were willing to believe him, but yet they still were sinful people. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So when you put all of this together, and knowing that Jacob's name means deceiver, it somehow seemed to characterize Jacob's life, a life of deception. But later toward the end, he's also known as Israel. Jacob is known as Israel. And then you end up with the children of Israel. God changes Jacob's name from Jacob to Israel, just as he changed Abraham's name. So you see all these similarities happening in the life of those particular people. And Jacob has this son, Joseph. You know the story. The other 11 boys, well, the other 10 boys kind of get jealous of him. They sell him off as a slave. And when you get to thinking of all of that stuff, you got to think, okay, this just can't be what God planned for our life, for his life. Jacob's most favorite son. Jacob's most favorite son. He sees the odds working against him. His most favorite son. And God had promised him that from that one, that many would bow down and would serve him. And you say, well, no, with all of this working against him, because listen, my son has died. They said an animal slaughtered him. The brothers concocted that lie that an animal has slaughtered him. So Jacob is thinking, this can't be, the way that God wanted it to be. These things are working against us. Truth of the matter, those things worked what? For them. So with that, let's jump to Genesis 28, verses 10 through 12. Genesis 28, verses 10 through 12. You see it in your commentary. It says, Then Jacob departed from Beersheba and went toward Haran is how many call it. He came to a certain place and spent the night there. Because the sun had set, he took one of the stones of the place and put it under his head, and he laid down in that place. He had a dream, and behold, a ladder was set on the earth with its top reaching to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and what? Descending on it. Reading from your commentary, because we cannot peer into the invisible realm of God, many things, if not most things, appear to happen by chance or mere contingency. We humans have a tendency to misread the hand of God in history. I wish I could take some time to go. We tend to misread the hand of God in history. From Hitler to black history to slavery and all of these things. Politics, who's president, what Republican. We tend to misread the hand of God in history. God's hand is always in history. This was surely the case in the life of the patriarch Jacob. Jacob had a life-changing experience at Bethel when he had an unexpected encounter with God. Jacob's midnight dream is the origin of the children's song that, sing, We Are Climbing Jacob's Ladder. The significance of the ladder was that it served as a link, a means of access between heaven and earth. It is significant for us because we live in an age when God seems remote and what? Unreachable. Modern humanity has an acute sense of the absence of God. There seems to be an unbridgeable chasm between the realm of nature and the realm of supernature. Between the immanent and the transcendent, it's as if a chasm or an inescalable wall bars access to heaven. And we use ladders to bridge the gap, to scale the wall between earth and higher places. Well, Jacob's experience is the event that's later alluded to by Christ. Look at John 1 and 51. In John 1 and 51, the Gospel of John 1:51, and Jesus said to him, Truly, truly, I say to you, you will see the heavens open and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. So here, Jacob's experience is the event that's later alluded to by Christ when he declared to Nathanael that he would see the angels. That's what he's talking about, Nathanael there, ascending and descending. Jesus was the incarnation of Jacob's ladder. The one who incarnation would make visible to us the invisible God. When Jacob awoke from his dream, he made an important observation. Look at verses 16 through 19. Back to chapter 28, 16 through 19. This is what he says. He says, Then Jacob awoke from his sleep, and he said, Surely the Lord is in this place. And here's the caveat, and I did not know it. No, that's a whole lot of preaching right there, y'all. He was afraid, and he said, How awesome is this place? This is none other than what? The house of God, and it is the gate of heaven. So Jacob rose early in the morning, and he took the stone that he had put on his head, and he set it up as a pillow and poured all on its top. He called the name of that place Bethel. However, previously the name of the city had been Luz. So here, Jesus, the incarnation of Jacob's ladder, the one who would make visible the invisible God, when he wakes up from this dream, he has this important observation, and Jacob became suddenly aware that God had been present, watch it y'all, but he had missed it. God had been present, but he had missed it. Based on what God had promised Jacob in 28 and 15, go back to 28 and 15. Notice what God promised Jacob. He said, behold, I'm with you, and I will keep you wherever you go. I know y'all thought this only came out of the book of Joshua. Because you read it in Joshua chapter 1 when he says, as I was with Moses, Joshua, I will be with you. You think that's the first time God had made that promise. But long before Joshua, he tells this same thing here to Jacob. Behold, I am with you, and I will keep you wherever you go. And I will bring you back to this land, the promised land. For I will not leave you until I have done what? What I have promised. So you got to understand, Jacob is looking at the situation, and it seems like everything is working against him, when the truth of the matter is working what? For him, because that's how the providence of God often is. And so Jacob don't understand, wait a minute, hold on. Okay, you said this was going to happen, but my son Joseph is dead. In his mind, Joseph is dead, because his sons told him he were, and then his other son, all these things are happening in his mind. And Jacob is saying, there's no way that, what God promised me can happen. So based on what God had promised Jacob there, that should have been enough for Jacob to trust God, but it wasn't. Now, let me ask you a question. When you read the Bible and know that God has said what it said, is that enough for you to trust him? Even though you may look at circumstances, at situations that seem to not be working for you, seem to be working against you, because God has made this promise to us, or to you, for those of us who are his children. Is that enough for you? Because it should be. When we know that God is not a man that he can lie, when we look at the history, the things that God have done in our lives, those things should propel us to walk even further and even more faithful with God. But now if we go through life thinking that we're in charge of all the circumstances, and the reason why we got stuff is because we know how to budget and manage and work, and we're smart, and we did something that somebody else didn't do, and that's how we got what we got. And if you go through life thinking that, then you might go through life trying to, protect yourself, your own interests, preserve. But even when you don't have nothing, and God has promised you something, is that enough for you? Even when you can't see how it's going to come, where it's going to come from, shouldn't it be enough for us to believe that it's going to come because God has promised it? See, ladies and gentlemen, if nothing, we ought to learn that at least from the life of Jacob. If nothing, we should learn from the life of Jacob when it looks like things ain't going to work out. When I recall what God has promised me, even though I can't see it, I've got to trust that it's going to work out. But if our limit or our view of God is limited to ration, to logic, to common sense, to human power, and we don't see God as God. If we don't see God as sovereign and mighty and almighty and providential and being able to work against the odds, if we don't see God like that, then we might default to like Jacob. Not trusting him. I'm sure Jacob's daddy told him the story of Isaac. See, that's what fathers did back in the day. Right? This is what we try to work with the men now. We're trying to tell them, man, you got a responsibility to change, to teach and train and your children and your family and your household. If they don't know the word of God, that's your responsibility. Back then, they would do that. We see it in the Old Testament. That was the responsibility of the man to sit down with his children, whether they was at the table, at the creek, walking through the garden, wherever they were at. They were to teach them the principles of God. So I know that Isaac told Jacob about the faith of his father Abraham. And his experience. Because remember, I told you, Isaac was not a little baby when God put him on the altar. Isaac know his experience, and I'm sure he passed that down to Jacob. And here's Jacob having doubts about God. It should have been enough for Jacob to trust God because of what God promised. Got to remember what God says in Genesis 28:15. This ain't to Abraham, and this ain't to Isaac. This is directly to Jacob. This ain't to Joseph. This ain't to none of us. This is to him and him alone. He says, behold, I am with you, and when I will keep you wherever you go. Not them, you. And I will bring you back to this land. I won't leave you until I have done what I have promised you. I don't know if you understand what I'm saying. See, the providence of God, sometimes we think God is absent in human history. We think God is not with us. We think he has left us, but he hasn't left us because he's going to fulfill his promise. God had promised if you turn over Jacob, and from that day forward, Jacob should have relied on God's promises. But because he did not have a continuous vision of the presence of God, he thought he didn't still have God's promises. Did you hear what I say? Y'all, when we look in those times in our lives, where it looked like we literally didn't see the, God in our lives, then we think that the promises are not still there. Or what is that story, famous story about, footprints in the sand? When you say you didn't see two footprints, and God say the reason why you didn't see two because the ones you see you think they're yours. He said they are mine because it's during that time I'm carrying you. See, the invisible God, the providence of God, he's always present with us. So wherever we go, he's with us, y'all. He never leaves us. He's always there. God is omnipresent. He's everywhere. Because there's no continual vision of the presence of God, that doesn't give us a right to doubt God's promises. Like with every true believer, God remains with us in an invisible manner, and he will keep his promises by any means necessary. It goes back to what I taught you the first night, the way that God make things happen. He make things happen directly, by using nature. Or he can make things happen miraculously by what? Not using nature. That's indirectly. If we fast forward in the story of Jacob's life, we will see that his confidence in the promise of God obviously faded. Let me ask you a question. Because I've never had anyone to unite with our church. Never in the life of the history of our church had anyone, I'm being facetious here, but basically say, look here, I'm going to join y'all, but, I'm still kind of doubting, if this is the place for me. I don't know. I'm going to go ahead and join because, I don't want to go to hell. And so I really ain't crazy about the preaching. I don't like what y'all do, but I'm going to go join. In the 20-something years, we ain't never had nobody join a church like that. Because we always give them a chance to talk in the back. We always give them a chance to talk in the back. And they always talk about, and positive about everything. Oh, I know the Lord sent me here. I know God sent me here. Oh, and the preaching of the word, and the teaching of the song, and the spirit of the people. Oh, I know God sent me. I know God sent me. But then something happens along the way, because when they leave, it seems as if all that enthusiasm that they once had has faded. And so that's the question that you have to ask yourself. Has your enthusiasm, have your commitment to the church, the body of Christ, the knowing that God's going to fulfill his promise, and there's some things that he desires for this church to do, has that faded? And if it's faded, it's because you have reprioritized some things over the things of God, and they look like they're taking priority and precedent over, the things of God. Well, that's what happened in the life of this patriarch, that God had made a promise to. It's obvious that his confidence in God had faded, and he needed to make things happen. Jacob began to trust in the outward appearances. What that means? And only the things he could see. You got to remember where he's at right now. There's a famine in the land over there. Joseph is second in command in Egypt. They over here in the land where God had promised it, and there's a famine going over there. Now they're looking around for food. They say, well, we know they got some food over there in Egypt. Why don't you go over there to Egypt and see if, they're alone or something, And when he sends his sons over there, they discover, what they didn't recognize at first, because Joseph was talking to a translator. That's why they didn't recognize his voice at first. That Joseph was the guy who was in charge. Joseph recognized his brothers. They said, well, why don't you bring, the other brother? Because Joseph wanted to make sure that his other brothers alive. They go back and tell their daddy Jacob, hey, when the man over there, if we bring, your other son over there and he believes that he's alive, Jacob's lights start coming on, get to thinking, well, wait a minute. What's going on here? And maybe now Jacob is recalling the promises of God. And you know what happened out of those 70 people who ended up going over to Egypt with Jacob, his family. From that came the nation of Israel, over 2 million people who ended up back in Egypt for over 400 years. But God's promises fulfilled. And Jacob, not Joseph, would have ever thought it would have happened like that. Because it seemed as if everything was working what? Against them. Joseph in jail, thrown away for his brothers, left for dead, picked up, go to jail. Story, y'all know, back in jail, a woman accused him of rape. He didn't do nothing. Story on and on and on. He's second in command, and he's going up and up and up. And the people who didn't want him to go up, going down, down, down. Somebody get that in a minute. See, it was like that at first. They saw Joseph like that, and God elevated Joseph, and in the elevating of Joseph, they. Ladies and gentlemen, don't discount the providence of God. Ain't never too late. Because when you get to glory, if you get there, as a dying thief will tell you, it ain't never too late. As long as you got breath in your body. The problem is we don't know when we're going to die. It ain't never too late. But we can do it before. It could be too late before we do it, but it ain't never too late. Till God calls our name and our time on earth is in. He quit writing his story inclusive of our story. Well, you know the story. He ends up coming back, and all of that takes place. And Joseph, who I'll say this, Joseph, let me just give you a few things. The story of Joseph is told, if you ever want to read it, it's from Genesis 37 to 50. I don't know if you know this, but over a quarter of the book of Genesis is about the life of Joseph. Over a quarter of the book of Genesis is about the life of Joseph's story, rather, is told. Joseph was the first son of Rachel and Jacob. He's the 11th of Jacob's 12 sons. Jacob's sons included Joseph, are listed in the, listed. Joseph was sold by his brothers into slavery. I'm just trying to take you through all those chapters. Joseph became the slave of Potiphar, a very high official in Egypt. Joseph did very well with God's help. Joseph was fully trusted by his master. Potiphar's wife took a fancy to Joseph. He refused to sin with her. She became angry and told lies. I like to say that was the first workplace, office place of what do you call it, discrimination, sexual harassment. That's the first, office, sexual harassment case, if you will, in the Bible. And she tells this story because she wouldn't lie with him, and she told lies on him, and so he was put in jail. That's Genesis 39. And then Joseph's ability to interpret dreams. Remember, Joseph, ability to interpret dreams. But who had a dream before Joseph? Jacob. Do you see the progeny? Do you see how it get passed down? So Joseph has an ability to interpret dreams, and that got him out of jail, and he won great favor with Pharaoh. And Joseph, he's made ruler over Egypt. Now, when this famine come with Pharaoh had dreamed of, Joseph had predicted, Joseph's father, brothers, and their family settled in Egypt where there was food. So Joseph was reunited with his family. Joseph lived to the age of 110. Having known his sons and children and their children. One other fact about Joseph is Pharaoh gave Joseph the name Zarephath-Peniah, and he gave his daughter to her to marry. You find that in Genesis 41. Before Jacob died, he gave his blessings to Joseph's two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. However, Jacob gave the greater blessing to the younger Ephraim. Does that sound familiar? Before Jacob's two sons died, Jacob, in blessing Joseph's son, he gave the blessing to the younger and not the older, because by law, it was to be given to the older. Remember how this started out? Jacob, who was the younger, stole the birthright from the older. And here, later, Jacob gives the birthright to the younger of Joseph's two boys. You see all that being played out. Before Jacob died, he gives that. That happened in Genesis 48. And then for those of you who've ever watched the movie, The Ten Commandments, there's one scene in The Ten Commandments. That's Genesis chapter 50. There's one scene in The Ten Commandments. They say it real quick, and they show it real quick. But you see all of the gold and silver and all that stuff being carried out and all of that stuff. But then there are some men who are carrying a body. They're carrying the body out. And that's the body of who? That's the body of Joseph, because Joseph has promised, that's the body of Joseph. That's his bones being taken like that, because before Joseph died, he told them to bury me not here in Egypt. I want to be buried in the promised land. That's Genesis 37 through 50 right there, ladies and gentlemen. So if we fast forward in life of him, back to your thing, we will see that his confidence in the promise of God obviously faded. Jacob began to trust in outward appearance. There's nowhere clearer than when Jacob had to deal with the loss of his son Joseph and all the consequences surrounding that event, which I just told you about. His son had not died. He thought he was dead. Reuben, the eldest son, assumed the present calamity that befell his brothers and him were a result of their gift. He was trying to read the invisible hand of God's providence. He was correct in assuming that their present state was intimately connected to their past sinful actions. I won't say this again, y'all. Because sometimes we wonder why this is happening to us. Why this happening to us now? Why am I going through this right now? It could very well be that it's connected, ladies and gentlemen, to our what? Sinful past actions. What he did not recognize was that the judgment that was falling upon them was profoundly mixed with grace, though. Reuben saw the judgment, but he missed the grace. I think one day, y'all, I'm going to have to preach that right there. He saw the judgment, but he missed the grace. So many times in life, we only see the bad, and we don't see the grace. We miss it, you know, and you know, things that are happening even in the land right now, you know, we see the bad that happened, you know, in Hawaii, but we miss the grace. We see the bad that's happening in places, but we miss the grace. This morning being the first day of school for us, and I was just thinking about all our grands who are going to school, and our prayers was, you know, I've seen the tragedy in all these elementary schools and middle schools and high school, and now we have grandkids in all, you know, high school, middle school, and elementary. And I couldn't help but to think of all of the tragedies. But at the same time, I was convicted to think of all of the grace. Except for the grace of God, what happened in that elementary school in Uvalde could happen in the elementary school right here in Pearland. See, we tend to, ladies and gentlemen, see the judgment, and we miss the grace. So what is the lesson for us? In Genesis 42:36, look at that verse, and I just need a couple more minutes, and I'll let this thing go. Genesis 42:36, it says, their father Jacob said to them, you have bereaved me of my children. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more. And you would take Benjamin, watch this, y'all, all these things are against me. You remember my title? It seems to work against us, but it's actually working what? For us. In Genesis 42:36, where Jacob had come to the ultimate conclusion in light of the disappearance of Joseph, because he's not dead, and now Simeon, Jacob declared all these things are against me. Man, the ones who I had great hope in. Jacob's cry sounds much like the cry that many Christians make at some point in their life. When things aren't working out the way we plan, we begin to believe nobody loves me, everybody, including God, hates me. Jacob was convinced that everything was working against him, but nothing could be further from the truth. The reality was that everything, what? Was working for him providentially. God in his providence was working all those things that seemed to work for bad, for good for Jacob and his descendants, but all outward signs pointed to the very what? Opposite. Job, Jonah, we can just go all through history. Those things seem to be working for bad. They really were working for good, and God is trying to get us to do something, to see something, so he could do something more for us. Let me get this straight. I should be willing to give God everything. Yes. Because he gave it to you. Everything. You're only here because of the grace of God. You don't have the job you have to earn the income you have because of the grace of God. You understand what I'm saying? And to think now that somehow you earn, deserve, and have a right to keep it. God says, I've given it to you so you can be a blessing to others. So watch it now, so I can be a blessing to you and others. One of the problems I have, even when working sometimes with other pastors, I said this recently to a group of pastors, I said, listen, guys, listen, God ain't concerned about no one church. And we keep functioning like if we, develop the biggest, the brightest, the most recognized church in the world, God ain't concerned about no one church. God's concerned about all the churches being one. But we keep wanting to function by making our church the one, when the goal is for all of us to work together in unity, in harmony, as one. So what we do is we disconnect ourselves from other ministries and people and churches and races and things and stuff like that, and we just build ourselves and then show God how good we are, and God is never impressed with that. We're like that person, he gave, 5, 10, 5, and 1, 2, and then, and he come back and you give him back the one, say, here, God, I gave you the one. And God said, why didn't you do something? You can at least put it in the bank and got some interest on it. But we keep coming up with this plan that I'm going to hold on to it because I never know what's going to happen, when God wants to do more for us. Because it's his story. It's his church. And he wants to get the glory. Sometimes we restrict God getting the glory based on how we want to tell the story. So here's a lesson. Jacob had come to the ultimate conclusion in life, the disappearance of Joseph, Simeon, all these things against Jacob. He cried, and Jacob was convinced that everything was working against him. Again, everything was working for him. God in his providence was working all those things that seemed to be working for bad, for good, for Jacob and his descendants. I need to say this again, y'all, for Jacob and his descendants, for Jacob and his descendants. God made a promise to Jacob, but the Jacob also included his descendants. And see, what happened is we always try to get singular in what we want from God, but God don't want to just work just with you alone. God want to do something with those who are descendants, those who are connected to you, those who are in relationship. God want to do something with them as well. All outward signs pointed to the very opposite. One of the axiomatic slogans of the Christian faith in Latin is a phrase that is called Deus pro nobis. Deus pro nobis. And that literally means God for us. In Romans 8:31, that's one of our chapters, our church. Romans 8:31 says, what then shall we say to these things? And in Latin, it literally says these words right there. It says, Deus pro nobis. God is for us. Who can be what? Against us. That God is for us, y'all, is, the cardinal point of the doctrine of providence. That's what the doctrine of providence is. That God is for us. He's not against us. God was for Jacob. God had promised that to Jacob years before his brothers returned to him without Simeon. But Jacob could not see how this could be. The very moment when he was most sure that all things, including God, were working against him, the truth of the matter is all things by the hand of God was actually what? Working for him. God had sent Joseph into Egypt for a purpose. That purpose would be worked out on every page of redemptive history. In the final analysis, the providence of God was enough for Jacob, the trickster, and ladies and gentlemen, it should be enough for us. Jacob lived to see something of the hidden hand of God. He did not see all of the purpose of providence unfold before his eyes, but he saw enough. I conclude with that statement tonight for us. Y'all, we may not have seen everything we want to see about God working in our lives, but we haven't seen enough. We have seen enough to trust him. When things seem to be working against us, you can be certain from the life of Jacob and Joseph and that story that they are actually working for us. Thank you so much for being here tonight.